Before we begin, do you have a theory about this case or a story of your own? Leave a message on our socials. Our handles are all just Nightwatch Files without the space, or head over to nightwatchfiles.com to find them all in one place. Your insights might be featured in a future episode. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Nightwatch Files. On Wednesday morning, April 3, 1985, Elizabeth Haysom became increasingly worried about her parents. She had been unable to reach Derek and Nancy all week, which was highly unusual given that they typically maintained contact with their daughter every few days. Elizabeth was the focus of their lives, and such prolonged silence was completely out of character. Elizabeth phoned Annie Massey and left a message with Annie's maid, asking Annie to check on her parents. Meanwhile, Nancy Haysom's bridge companions were facing their own concerns. Derek had a regular bridge game with Jane Riggs, Marilyn Baker, and Constance Johansson, and he never missed these appointments, especially when he was hosting at his own home. When Derek failed to appear for the scheduled game, the three women tried knocking on the door and checking the garden, but received no response. Growing increasingly worried, the three women went to Mitchell's store and called Annie Massey themselves. When Annie Massey arrived in front of the modest two-story house in Boonesboro, Virginia, she was met by the three women who were already there and visibly distressed. Annie informed them that Elizabeth had called her just before they did, also requesting that she check on her parents. Annie also understood the significance of Derek's absence from his regular bridge game. He and Nancy were known to be reliable people who wouldn't miss commitments without reason. As Annie surveyed the property, she noticed that both the Haysoms' van, which they called the Bronze Belle, and Derek's BMW were parked in their customary spots. The presence of both vehicles didn't immediately indicate a problem, but combined with their absence from scheduled activities, Annie recognized this had the earmarks of an emergency. Fortunately, Annie had the means to investigate further. Nancy had given her a dull brass key long ago, specifically for checking on the house when they were away. Annie approached the front door slowly, the anxiety evident on the faces of the three women beside her, adding to her own growing fearfulness. She inserted the key into the lock, and the tumblers clicked noisily in the quiet afternoon air. Annie twisted the handle and cautiously swung the door open, just a crack. She called out, "Hello," more loudly than she had intended, then tried again more softly. "Nancy? Derek?" The house remained silent. Jane Riggs expressed what they were all feeling. Something's very wrong. Her words carried the weight of a strong premonition that something terrible had happened inside. Annie took a deep breath and gave the door a gentle push, opening it another 8 inches. The wider opening immediately revealed what she had hoped not to find. Derek Haysom lay sprawled on the floor, barely 2 strides away from the entrance. He was surrounded by a huge dark stain that Annie knew intuitively was dried blood. "Oh my God," Annie gasped. She turned to Jane and exclaimed, "It's Derek. He's right there on the floor. He's covered with blood." The scene before her made one thing immediately clear. With that much blood surrounding Derek's motionless form, there was no way he could be alive. Annie quickly closed the door, physically blocking Marilyn Baker, who had started to push forward in an attempt to see or help. Annie confirmed that she had not seen Nancy and made it clear she did not want to. The implications of what they had discovered were already overwhelming enough. Taking control of the situation, Annie firmly instructed the other women that they could not go inside. This was now a crime scene, and Derek had clearly been dead for a long time. The most important thing now was to contact the police immediately. Annie relocked the door and carefully put the key away. She then drove the panic-stricken women to Mitchell's store, where they called Dr. William Massey. Dr. Massey, understanding the gravity of the situation, immediately contacted the Bedford County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Joe Stanley arrived at the Haysom residence at precisely 4:15 p.m. The front door opened onto a scene that would be burned into his memory for years to come. Derek Haysom lay on his back, his head pressed against the fireplace jamb, his body unnaturally still. It was immediately apparent he had been dead for several days. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. The living room was a tableau of violence, a space that had once been orderly, now transformed into something unrecognizable. Sergeant Jeffrey Brown, the Lynchburg Police Department's lab technician, was soon on the scene. He would later describe what he saw as a sea of gore. Nearly 90% of the floors in the living room, dining room, and kitchen were coated in blood. The splatters were everywhere, in 52 distinct locations, varying in size and intensity. Testing revealed that most of the blood was Derek's, type A. Nancy's blood, type AB, was present in smaller amounts. Traces of type O and a single type B stain were also found, their origin unexplained. Derek's body bore the evidence of a brutal and relentless assault. He had been slashed and stabbed some 36 times with a large, very sharp knife. 2 horizontal gashes marred the left side of his face. One severed his ear completely. Another deep slash crossed his right cheek. Most devastating was the massive wound that encircled his neck, wide and deep, the kind of injury that spoke of rage and precision. His hands bore 6 separate cuts, including a deep gash across the left palm, indicating a desperate attempt to grab the blade. One knuckle was abraded, as though he had struck his attacker. One of the stab wounds had penetrated his heart. Derek Haysom had been subjected to an unimaginable level of violence. Nancy Haysom was found in the kitchen, curled on the linoleum floor, at the center of a large brown stain. The slash across her throat was grotesque, so deep she was all but decapitated. 2 stab wounds marked her torso, one to the heart, the other piercing the peritoneal cavity. Additional injuries included a cut to her jaw, a superficial wound to her left breast, and an incised wound on her left elbow, likely sustained as she raised her arm in a defensive gesture. In the dining room, 3 chairs had been pushed back from the table. On it sat the remnants of a meal: a dirty plate, a bowl, a wine glass, and a neatly folded paper napkin, now soaked in blood. Investigators concluded that 3 people had sat there. 2 were now dead. The third, it seemed, had been the killer, someone the Haysoms knew well enough to invite to their home. As the investigators examined the house further, faint, ghostly footprints became visible when treated with luminol. They glowed blue-green in the darkened rooms, tracing a path from the living room into a bedroom and then to the bathroom. The conclusion was inescapable. The killer had taken a shower to remove the blood. Other prints led from the door to the driveway, looping around nearby trees. A second set veered into the yard, leaving swishing marks in the grass, as if someone had vigorously wiped their bloody feet. Investigators theorized that the killer had returned to the house, perhaps to ensure that both victims were dead by slitting their throats. Toxicology reports confirmed that both Derek and Nancy had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.22%, well above the legal limit for driving. They had been very drunk when the attack occurred, leaving them vulnerable to the violence that would consume them. The extreme nature of the killings convinced Sheriff C.H. Wells that the perpetrator harbored a deep hatred for the couple. Given the strength required and the extent of the mutilation, he believed the killer was male. Sergeant Brown, acting on a hunch, consulted 2 Richmond detectives experienced in cult-related crimes. They examined photographs of the scene and noted unusual details. Both bodies had been positioned facing north. Around them, the blood appeared deliberately outlined, as though someone had consciously painted it. Near Nancy's body, a mousetrap had been placed on the bloodied floor. It was sprung but empty, holding a small piece of cheese. The detectives concluded it had been positioned after the blood dried, and it was also pointed north. The silverware on the dining room table had been aligned in the same direction. Every candle in the house had been burned. Between where Nancy and Derek had sat, there was a puddle of an unidentified black waxy substance. The dining room chairs were arranged in a semicircle. Derek's chin bore a peculiar V-shaped cut. In the smeared blood on the floor, the detectives claimed they could make out what appeared to be a 6 inside a V. a symbol they identified as representing the Antichrist. They told investigators these details suggested a satanic ritual. While they did not definitively claim it was cult activity, they believed that if it was, it had likely been carried out by someone inexperienced or experimenting. They also acknowledged that the signs could have been deliberately staged to mislead the police. The Richmond detectives' assessment muddied the investigatory waters, as homicide squad members debated the significance. Some dismissed the observations as overreach. Others were fascinated, spending evenings poring over books on Satanism, hoping to find a connection. With no other leads, the Satanism hypothesis gained prominence. The brutality of the murders affected investigators deeply. One 25-year veteran officer began sleeping with a pistol under his pillow. Another, Sergeant Carol Baker, a SWAT team member unaccustomed to fear, admitted that returning home at night made him uneasy, imagining the Haysom's bodies on his own kitchen floor. Detectives Ricky Gardner and Chuck Reed, frustrated and desperate, even consulted a psychic. They brought items of the victim's clothing and sealed photographs of potential suspects. The psychic claimed she saw a man in dark clothing standing outside the windows, feeling the knife and sensing the pain inflicted, but she provided no actionable information. A second visit was equally unproductive. On Easter Sunday, April 7, 1985, over 100 mourners gathered at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. The church, frequented by the city's elite, provided an unlikely venue for a memorial service that neither of the deceased had ever attended. Derek and Nancy Haysom were gone, their bodies already cremated as soon as the medical examiner's office had released them. There would be no traditional funeral. Instead, family members had arranged this solemn gathering to remember two lives that had been brutally cut short just days earlier. Reverend Alexander Robertson spoke briefly before yielding the podium to Richard, Nancy's 31-year-old son from Calgary. Richard, an architect who had considered Derek his stepfather, delivered a moving eulogy that left barely a dry eye in the room. He urged those present to focus not on the horrific manner of Derek and Nancy's deaths, but on the lives they had lived. His words called for strength, for the capacity to continue loving and forgiving in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Among the mourners sat the surviving children: Howard, a 32-year-old surgeon from Houston; Varian, a 36-year-old criminal defense lawyer from Nova Scotia; and Julian, a 33-year-old engineer. Elizabeth Haysom stood discreetly to one side, supported by her University of Virginia roommate, Charlene Song, and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Jens Zuring. At 20 years old, Elizabeth was Derek and Nancy's only child of their current marriage. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Shortly before 1 p.m. of the following day, Monday, April 8th, a tan van known as the Bronze Bell pulled up to Boonesboro Elementary School. The school had been transformed into a command post for the investigation into Derek and Nancy Haysom's murders. Elizabeth Haysom sat in the passenger seat while Jens Zuring gripped the steering wheel. Elizabeth emerged from the van alone, exchanging only a few words with Jens before he drove away. She entered the makeshift headquarters and requested to speak with investigator Ricky Gardner. Her British accent immediately struck the Lynchburg police officers present, pure, elegant, and disarming. For many of them, such a voice existed only in movies. The interview would be conducted by Gardner from Bedford County and Debbie Kirkland, a veteran investigator from the Lynchburg Police Department. This pairing represented the Regional Homicide Squad's commitment to maintaining collaboration across jurisdictions. Elizabeth came prepared. She carried her lunch, a thick sandwich carefully wrapped in saran wrap, which she consumed with dainty but enthusiastic bites throughout the 4-hour session. Even when Gardner set up his tape recorder, she maintained her composure, appearing remarkably poised for someone whose parents had been savagely murdered just days earlier. The investigators had a primary objective: establishing Elizabeth's whereabouts during the weekend of March 29th through 31st, when Derek and Nancy Haysom had been killed. Elizabeth's account was precise. The last time she had seen her parents, she claimed, was the weekend of March 23rd and 24th, when she had taken a bus from Charlottesville to help celebrate her father's birthday. Her parents had driven her back to Charlottesville on Sunday, March 24th, and since then, she had spoken to them only once, on Thursday, March 28th, for a brief hello. She explained that she had prearranged to call them again on Sunday, March 31st, at approximately 8 p.m. Such specific scheduling was necessary, she said, because they often had difficulty reaching each other. The call was meant to discuss her housing situation, as her landlady preferred not to have undergraduates in the house. For the murder weekend itself, Elizabeth provided what seemed like a straightforward alibi. She and Jens had rented a car in Charlottesville and driven to Washington, D.C. to spend a couple of days during a quiet period at school. They had returned on March 31st. The trip, she explained, was simply to spend time together, visiting art galleries, memorials, and taking in some movies. But when Gardner pressed for a motive, who might have wanted Derek and Nancy Haysom dead, Elizabeth's responses took an unexpected turn. Rather than providing straightforward answers, Elizabeth offered what could only be described as a shopping list of potential enemies her father had allegedly made during his time in Canada. According to Elizabeth, Derek had invented a revolutionary submerged injection process that transformed steelmaking while working for Sydney Steel. However, this breakthrough had come at a cost. Canadian unions, fearing widespread job losses, had turned against him. Local politicians, whom Derek supposedly considered scum, had also grown to despise him, partly due to his South African background and accusations of discrimination. Elizabeth painted a picture of a man under siege. She claimed her father had been screwed big time over his invention, leading to strikes and personal abuse that extended to his family. The hostility had been so intense, she alleged, that she had been threatened at school and even had her front teeth knocked out due to her father's anti-union stance. The pressure had eventually forced Derek to resign from Sydney Steel. He had then taken a lucrative position as chairman and president of Metropolitan Area Growth Investments Limited, known as MAGI, a venture capital organization. But even there, scandal had followed. A controversy involving a mortgage for a cruise ship had led to Derek's resignation from MAGI as well. Elizabeth emphasized the tremendous ill will her father faced and his rage over these events. The stress, she suggested, had become so overwhelming that Derek had literally walked out of their magnificent family home after selling it. Gardner listened carefully to this elaborate narrative, but a nagging question remained. While there may have been many reasons for people to harbor anger toward Derek Haysom, was any of it compelling enough to motivate someone to travel from Nova Scotia to Virginia to commit a double murder? The uncertainty surrounding motive reflected the broader frustration felt by investigators and the community alike. 3 days after the memorial service, the Lynchburg News and Daily Advance published an editorial titled, "What Possible Motive for Such Brutal Slayings?" The piece captured the widespread bewilderment over the unsolved murders, questioning both the unusual brutality for the area and the complete absence of an apparent motive. On Friday, April 12th, Elizabeth wrote a brief note about the murders. The letter revealed considerable hostility and anger, not just about the killings themselves, but about being questioned by police. She attributed her parents' butchering to America's savagery and brutality. More tellingly, she complained that U.S. law enforcement officials had harassed her as a principal suspect simply because her parents did not give her a car. By mid-April, Sheriff Wells recognized that the investigation would be protracted and assigned it to a specific team, Ricky Gardner and Chuck Reed. Gardner began reviewing Elizabeth's April 8th interview notes, paying particular attention to her statement about renting a car for the Washington trip. What Gardner discovered would change the entire trajectory of the case. The 1985 Chevette that Elizabeth and Jens had rented showed 669 more miles on its odometer when returned on March 31st than when it had been checked out on March 29th. A simple round trip to Washington, D.C. would account for approximately 230 miles. The discrepancy was significant and suspicious. Gardner began calculating. A trip to Lynchburg and back would cover around 640 miles. Add some driving around Washington, D.C., and the total could easily reach 669 miles. The numbers aligned too perfectly to ignore. He needed to speak with Elizabeth again. On Tuesday, April 16th at 10:40 p.m., Gardner met Elizabeth at the UVA Police Department. The atmosphere had changed dramatically since their first encounter. Elizabeth had complained about Gardner to her brother Howard, who had contacted lawyer John Lowe and requested that no further questioning of the Haysom family occur without legal representation present. Sheriff Wells had refused this demand, stating that Elizabeth herself would need to decline the interview. She had not done so, but her willingness to speak now carried a different tone. Gardner abandoned his previous friendly approach, accompanied this time by Sergeant Carol Baker of the Lynchburg Police Department. The questions came sharper and more direct. When confronted with the 669 miles on the rental car, Elizabeth's composure finally cracked. She became visibly nervous, offering explanations that seemed to shift with each question. They had detoured, she claimed. They had gotten lost in Warrenton. They had driven a lot around Washington and neighboring areas. She contradicted herself repeatedly, first saying they had rented a car several times and might have gone to Lexington, then insisting they had gone straight to Washington and only gotten lost on the way. When Gardner inquired whether her parents had liked Yentz, Elizabeth evaded the question, claiming they had given her money for the Washington trip and had shared supper together. She denied that her parents had objected to her relationship with Yentz, a statement that those who knew the family recognized as an outright lie. Then, as the interview stretched past midnight, Elizabeth launched into what Gardner would later describe as an improbable and horrific tale. She claimed that her mother Nancy had a first husband who was bisexual, who had beaten her mother, and who was a cannibal that had eaten their 3-month-old baby, putting the child in intensive care. She suggested this mysterious ex-husband might be the real killer. Gardner recognized the story for what it was, an attempt to send investigators on a wild goose chase. As the interview concluded well after midnight, Gardner asked how difficult it would be to get in touch with Yentz. Elizabeth stammered that she didn't know his schedule. Throughout the spring and summer of 1985, the investigation continued along multiple paths. Early suspicions had fallen on Margaret Louise Simmons, Derek's son, Julian Haysom's ex-fiancée, due to her psychological problems and the broken engagement when Julian married someone else. However, forensic reports eventually eliminated her as a suspect. By June 1985, the Regional Homicide Squad began withdrawing personnel due to lack of progress, leaving only Reed and Gardner to pursue the case. During this period, Elizabeth and Yentz traveled to Europe for what they described as a holiday. Yentz's father had insisted he spend time in Germany. They visited Berlin, where Elizabeth telephoned Colonel Harrington, who invited them to dinner. Harrington, a friend of Elizabeth's, would later note their carefree attitude. They seemed indecently happy despite the recent murders. Annie Massey, a family friend, was similarly troubled by Elizabeth's apparent lack of grief and her insistence on bringing both Yentz and Charlene Song with her to Boonesboro immediately after learning of the murders. Meanwhile, Gardner and Reed remained convinced that Elizabeth was lying about the rental car mileage. The excess 400 miles could almost exactly account for a round trip to Boonesboro, the scene of her parents' murders. On July 2nd, a state crime lab report identified Elizabeth's fingerprints on a vodka bottle found at Loose Chippings, the Haysom family home. Gardner found this unremarkable, as Elizabeth would naturally have left prints throughout her family's residence. An August 29th report stated that Julian Haysom could not be eliminated as a suspect based on foot impressions found at the scene. However, Julian was known to have been in Canada at the time of the murders, highlighting the limitations of forensic analysis without proper context. By September 12th, additional unidentified fingerprints were traced to one of the first officers on the scene, and attempts to lift prints from evidence using laser technology proved unsuccessful. Reed and Gardner had systematically eliminated other suspects. Margaret Louise Simmons, Julian Haysom, and various cult-related theories that had circulated in the community. Their focus had narrowed to Elizabeth and Jens. It was time, they decided, to put some pressure on them. In late September, they tracked down Jens and arranged to interview him during the first week of October. Gardner and Reed employed a classic good cop, bad cop routine during their interview with Jens in Bedford. They pressed him to provide a date when he would submit to fingerprinting, footprint analysis, and a blood sample that could be compared with alien blood found at the crime scene. Jens stalled, claiming he had exams to worry about, but eventually agreed to make himself available around mid-October, the 15th or 16th. A couple of days later, Howard Haysom called Elizabeth with what he described as potentially good news. Gardner and Reed, he said, might soon make an arrest in the case. The effect on Jens was immediate and telling. He panicked. By the next morning, he had made arrangements to fly to Europe. On Saturday, before the scheduled October 16th appointment, Jens systematically wiped his fingerprints from his apartment and his red Sirocco. The car was later found abandoned at National Airport in Washington. Reed would later note the irony. One detective had theorized early in the investigation that the killer drove a red car. 24 hours later, on Sunday, Elizabeth followed Jens into flight. On Wednesday, October 16th, the very day Gardner and Reed had planned to collect Jens's forensic samples, Howard called with startling news. Elizabeth and Jens had run away, probably back to Europe. Howard accompanied the detectives to Charlottesville, where they searched the house Elizabeth had shared with Charlene Song. There, they found 2 letters that would prove to be the final pieces of evidence they would collect before the case took an international turn. Charlene Song handed Howard an undated note from Elizabeth. The message was brief but telling. She was leaving with Jens for an unspecified destination and urged her family not to attempt to find her. Gardner received a 2-page handwritten letter from Jens. The tone was sarcastic throughout, with Jens advising the investigators not to make a mess while searching through his belongings. He claimed he was incapable of committing such murders due to his pacifism and suggested he was leaving because of general unhappiness at the University of Virginia. He also expressed regret that Elizabeth had provided her fingerprints and blood sample to investigators. As Howard examined the house, he noticed that some of Nancy's jewelry appeared to be missing. His reaction to this discovery revealed the complicated emotions the case had stirred within the surviving family. If Elizabeth and Jens were ultimately proven to be involved in the murders, he stated he hoped they would be arrested and tried. He would not advocate for leniency, even for his sister. This sentiment spoke to the broader tragedy that had befallen the Haysom family. Derek had trusted Elizabeth completely, even as he harbored suspicions about her boyfriend. Before his death, Derek had told Howard to take care of Elizabeth if anything ever happened to him, describing her as a very loving and responsible child. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Elizabeth Roxanne Haysom was born in Salisbury, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in 1964. She entered the world as the only child born to Derek and Nancy Haysom together, though she would grow up surrounded by the complexities of a blended family. Derek, an engineer who had built his career managing projects across 3 continents, was 46 years old when he married Nancy, who was 27. The age difference between her parents was significant, but perhaps more defining for Elizabeth was the fact that she was a full decade younger than her half-siblings. This age gap effectively meant that Elizabeth was raised as an only child, despite the presence of 5 other children from her parents' previous marriages. Derek had brought 3 children to the union: Varian, Julian, and Fiona. Nancy contributed 2 sons from her first marriage to Ian Hall, Howard Henry and Richard Platt. Nancy herself came from distinguished Virginia lineage. Born Nancy Astor Benedict, she was a blood relative and goddaughter of the renowned Lady Astor. Her maternal grandmother, Hallie Hutter Gibbs, was Lady Astor's first cousin. The connection was significant enough that Lady Astor had attended Nancy's first wedding ceremony, despite her parents' disapproval of the match. From her earliest years, Elizabeth displayed an intense craving for affection. She would frequently pen sentimental notes to her parents, slipping them under their bedroom door as physical manifestations of her need for attention and validation. Derek and Nancy, for their part, seemed to meet these emotional demands during Elizabeth's early childhood. In 1965, when Elizabeth was barely a toddler, the family relocated to Luxembourg after Derek left Rhodesia behind. It was during these early European years that an incident occurred that would leave both physical and psychological scars on the young girl. Before Elizabeth reached her 10th birthday, she suffered what she would later describe as a horrible wound on her cheek from a dog bite. The incident was serious enough to trigger a child welfare investigation. According to Elizabeth's later recollections, a social worker even recommended her removal from her parents' custody. Whether this traumatic event directly influenced the decision to send Elizabeth away to boarding school, or whether it simply coincided with her parents' educational plans, remains unclear. Elizabeth herself would later connect these 2 events, though she also acknowledged that being sent away might have been something she herself had desired. Elizabeth's education would take place far from her family, across some of Europe's most prestigious institutions. She began at St. George's in Switzerland, before moving to Riddlesworth, an elite elementary school in Britain that had also been attended by Princess Diana. Her final destination would be Wycombe Abbey, one of the most highly regarded girls' schools in the United Kingdom. It was during her time at St. George's that Elizabeth experienced what she would later describe as a sexual assault. She claimed to have been raped at age 10 by 2 or more French youths on the school grounds. The details of this alleged incident would shift depending on who she told. To her brother Howard, and apparently to her parents, she described a different scenario involving genital exposure by a single man. More damaging than the incident itself, according to Elizabeth, was her parents' reaction. She felt they treated her horribly afterwards, with her mother allegedly blaming her for what had occurred, even going so far as to call her a little whore. Her father's response, she claimed, was to pretend the incident had never happened at all. This experience contributed to her being moved from St. George's to Riddlesworth. Her 2 years at Riddlesworth passed without notable incident, as did her initial years at Wycombe Abbey. Elizabeth proved to be an exceptional student, extremely bright, uncommonly articulate, amazingly energetic, and frightfully ambitious. She excelled academically, specializing in English, history, and languages, including Latin, German, French, and Greek. Her academic achievements were impressive. Distinction level in English, Latin, Greek, and French translation, combined with A's in history and applied mathematics. Beyond academics, Elizabeth demonstrated leadership qualities that earned her the position of head of house in her junior year, making her responsible for overseeing more than 36 girls in her dormitory. She was also a prolific creative force, authoring plays and poetry, and her musical talents on piano and cello earned her awards from the Royal Academy of Music. Yet beneath these achievements, a profound disconnection was taking root. Elizabeth's relationship with her parents became increasingly strained as she progressed through her boarding school years. She saw Derek and Nancy primarily during holidays, brief interludes that seemed to emphasize rather than bridge the growing distance between them. During these visits, Elizabeth felt her mother smothered her with affection. Perhaps Nancy's attempt to compensate for the extended separations, but an approach that only seemed to drive her daughter further away. The breaking point came when Nancy and Derek made a unilateral decision that would fundamentally alter Elizabeth's academic trajectory. Without consulting their daughter, they arranged for her to take high-level science and mathematics classes, clearly intending for her to follow in Derek's footsteps and become an engineer. For Elizabeth, who had been passionately focused on history and humanities, this redirection was devastating. She would later describe it as a blow to her self-esteem and a hateful blow among many others inflicted by her parents. The forced shift contradicted everything she had envisioned for her academic future and represented, in her mind, a complete dismissal of her own desires and ambitions. The consequences were immediate and severe. Elizabeth's grades plummeted as she struggled with subjects that held no interest for her. The academic failure forced her to repeat her entire senior year while all her friends graduated and moved on to university. This humiliation fostered what she would later describe as a reservoir of ill will toward her parents, resentment that would only deepen with time. During this period, Elizabeth's personal appearance began to reflect her internal rebellion. She gained weight and adopted what observers described as a punkish, dykish look, cutting her hair short in a style that set her apart from her more conventional classmates. More concerning, her drug abuse became apparent. Elizabeth later claimed that her substance use had begun with raiding her parents' liquor cabinet during visits to Nova Scotia, but it had evolved during her time at boarding school. Chemicals, she discovered, were easier to obtain and conceal than alcohol in the school environment. It was during this tumultuous period that Elizabeth formed what would become a defining relationship of her final school years. She developed a close, furtive alliance with another student who, like herself, felt disconnected from family expectations and conventional school life. Melinda Duncan was, in many ways, Elizabeth's kindred spirit. She too was an eccentric student who harbored deep unhappiness about her family situation. Melinda was a lesbian, and during their travels together, her relationship with Elizabeth evolved into a romantic one. Elizabeth's own sexual history was, by her own admission, murky. She acknowledged a sexual experience with another girl when she was 12 or 13, though she dismissed its significance. Both young women found themselves united by their shared desire for what Elizabeth would later characterize as freedom and adventure. They longed to escape the constraints of their family's expectations and the rigid academic environment that seemed determined to shape them into versions of themselves they didn't recognize. Melinda's situation paralleled Elizabeth's in its academic disappointment. Her application to Oxford University had been rejected, leaving her facing what she considered the unacceptable prospect of attending a second-rate school in Edinburgh. The final crisis came virtually on the eve of Elizabeth's completion at Wycombe Abbey. Her drug use, which she had managed to conceal for an extended period, was finally discovered by school officials. The timing could not have been worse. She was on the verge of sitting her final examinations, the results of which would determine her university placement. School officials informed Elizabeth that she would have to leave under a very dark cloud. This effectively destroyed any hope she might have harbored of gaining admission to Cambridge University, an aspiration that had survived even her forced academic redirection toward the sciences. Elizabeth's version of these events painted the discovery as a deliberate setup. She claimed that school officials had framed her in the drug incident, leading to police ransacking her room and keeping her isolated and incommunicado. The experience, she said, caused her to flip out. Whether the discovery was the result of a setup or simply the inevitable consequence of her increasingly reckless behavior, the result was the same. Elizabeth faced academic ruin and family disgrace. Driven by anger, frustration, and what they both characterized as a desperate longing for freedom, Elizabeth and Melinda made a decision that would define the next chapter of their lives. They chose to abandon both family and academia entirely. The timing was symbolic. On July 1st, 1983, the very day they completed their last examinations, Elizabeth and Melinda slipped away from the Wycombe Abbey campus and began what would become their flight to the continent. Their escape was carefully planned to create confusion about their true destination. They constructed what appeared to be a straightforward itinerary: attendance at a rock concert in Milton Keynes, followed by a ferry to Holland and a train journey to West Berlin, using one-way tickets that suggested a planned return. The reality was different. Instead of following this ostensible route, they traveled to Dover, took a ferry across the Channel to France, and made their way to Paris. Elizabeth had taken precautions to obscure their trail. Despite possessing a valid Canadian passport, she had obtained a new British visitor's passport the night before their departure. This additional document would potentially make it more difficult for her parents to track their movements across Europe. For 4 months, July through October, Elizabeth and Melinda moved almost constantly across Europe, often hitchhiking from city to city. Their journey took them through Bonn, Trier, Luxembourg, Reims, Dijon, San Remo, and Genoa, among other destinations. What Elizabeth would later romanticize as an adventure was in reality a descent into desperation and danger. Both young women were heavily into drugs during this period, a habit that only compounded their precarious situation. When they could find work, they took menial jobs to survive. They spent time picking grapes for Moet Chandon and another vintner near A in northern France, though they were forced to leave the latter position when the vintner made sexual advances toward Elizabeth. When legitimate work was unavailable, their survival methods became increasingly desperate. They resorted to selling their blood for money and possibly their bodies. The physical toll of their lifestyle became evident when Melinda was hospitalized for 3 days in Italy due to anemia. During her recovery, they stayed at a Hare Krishna compound. Their relationship during this period evolved beyond friendship. They became lovers, sharing a bed and referring to each other affectionately as Melly and Bunny. Yet even this intimate bond couldn't shield them from the escalating dangers they would encounter. In Nice, they were mugged by a knife-wielding man, but this attack would pale in comparison to what awaited them in Berlin. By October 13th, Elizabeth and Melinda had hitchhiked to Berlin, their money nearly exhausted. Germany's rigid work rules prevented them from finding employment, leaving them increasingly desperate. They had no coats, and their emaciated state reflected months of poor nutrition and drug abuse. They ended up in a flop house, vulnerable and far from any help. In Berlin, they initially fell in with what were described as American oddballs. But their situation took a dramatically more sinister turn when they encountered a gang of Irishmen claiming to be IRA terrorists. These men took Elizabeth and Melinda into their quarters, where they subjected the young women to 4 days of systematic abuse. The Irishmen heavily drugged Elizabeth and Melinda with various chemicals, including hallucinogens, keeping them half knocked out, while passing them among themselves for their sexual pleasure. For 4 days, the two young women existed in a drugged haze while being repeatedly sexually assaulted by their captors. On October 25th, Elizabeth and Melinda managed to slip away from their abusers. By this point, their appearance reflected the trauma they had endured. They looked disreputable. Elizabeth had a gash on her head, and most of her hair had been shaved into a pink mohawk. Both had lost considerable weight. Their skin had taken on a gray, sickly pallor, their clothes were in rags, and their underwear had been stolen or destroyed. In their desperate state, they made their way to the British consulate, seeking help to return home. While Elizabeth and Melinda had been living their nightmare across Europe, Derek and Nancy Haysom had been desperately trying to locate their missing daughter. Conventional methods had yielded little success, leaving Nancy particularly distressed and experiencing what she described as strong premonitions of tragedy. Faced with the failure of traditional search methods, Derek and Nancy turned to unconventional ones. Nancy's friend, Annie Massey, connected them with Colonel Stuart Harrington, an Army intelligence officer stationed in Munich. Nancy provided Harrington with a detailed description of Elizabeth, including color photographs. When Elizabeth appeared at the British consulate in Berlin, the official immediately recognized her from Harrington's description. However, the recognition came with a warning: you're going to find what is left of her. Colonel Harrington was shocked by Elizabeth's condition when he first encountered her. She stared blankly into space, chain smoked continuously, and her hands shook uncontrollably. Concerned about spooking the young women and causing them to flee back into what he termed the Berlin semi-underground, Harrington approached them gently. He assured them that Nancy was worried and only wanted their safety. Harrington and his wife took Elizabeth and Melinda home with them to recuperate. During this period, Harrington observed that Elizabeth had serious problems, both physical and psychological. She was hemorrhaging from the vagina, later diagnosed as a heavy menstrual period, though she worried about pregnancy, and was louse-infested. Harrington was troubled by what he observed as the loyalty and sexual bonds that had developed between Elizabeth and Melinda. He initially hoped to separate them, but quickly realized it was impossible at that point. He concluded that Melinda was the aggressor in their relationship and noted that she possessed a stack of lesbian pornography. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. 8 days after arriving at the Harringtons' home, Elizabeth and Melinda were put on a plane to London, where they were met by Elizabeth's half-brother Julian. Derek then flew over from Canada to collect his daughter. The reunion between Melinda and her father was described as less than joyous. After a meal together, Melinda's father departed without her, leaving her to stay with Elizabeth and Derek. Elizabeth persuaded Melinda to return home to her parents, with the understanding that she could come to Virginia if things didn't work out with her family. Derek paid for Melinda's train ticket, and she was met by a relative who arranged for her enrollment in a local college. This separation effectively ended Elizabeth and Melinda's relationship. Elizabeth would write to Melinda only once after returning to Virginia. Later, when speaking to investigators, Elizabeth would claim that her parents had been delighted and completely understanding about her European adventure. She even suggested they thought she had got that out of her system. This characterization was entirely false. Elizabeth also attempted to minimize the duration of their absence, claiming they had been away for about 5 months or something. In reality, they had been found on October 25, 1983, meaning they had been gone for less than 4 months. Elizabeth would eventually return to Virginia to attend the University of Virginia, as her parents had long desired. Derek and Nancy had moved to Boonesboro, Virginia, in 1982, partly to facilitate Elizabeth's attendance at UVA. Their home, which Nancy had named Loose Chippings after a dwelling in an obscure British novel, was located in central Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountain country. The name was particularly fitting, as in the novel, the house served as a way station for eccentrics, a description Nancy found especially applicable to their own situation. The modest 2-story house was situated about 1.5 miles outside the Lynchburg city limits, just over the Bedford County line on Holcomb Rock Road. Lynchburg was where Nancy herself had grown up, making their residence a return to familiar territory for her, if not for Elizabeth. During the summer of 1984, while Derek was away in Nova Scotia on business, Elizabeth and Nancy spent considerable time together. According to Elizabeth's later statements, it was during this period that Nancy took nude photographs of her daughter. The circumstances surrounding these photographs, as Elizabeth described them, revealed the deeply troubled nature of her relationship with her mother. Elizabeth claimed that toward the end of the summer, after they had traveled to Rochester, New York, for Elizabeth to attend a writer's seminar, Nancy became upset at the prospect of her daughter leaving for the University of Virginia. Nancy was reportedly searching for a way to keep her daughter from breaking loose again. During what Elizabeth characterized as a very vicious argument, Nancy allegedly told Elizabeth that she wanted to impress upon me how absolutely filthy and disgusting I was. According to Elizabeth, her mother demanded that she prove her filthy and disgusting nature by allowing the photographs to be taken. During some of the poses, Elizabeth claimed Nancy made her kneel. This incident was part of what Elizabeth described as a pattern of inappropriate behavior by her mother. She consistently claimed that Nancy had a history of sleeping in the same bed with her, often unclothed, ever since I was a little girl. Elizabeth stated that the last time this occurred was on March 23, 1985, the Saturday before Derek and Nancy were murdered. While Elizabeth described Nancy as very affectionate and aggressively affectionate, she portrayed these encounters as non-sexual in nature. Elizabeth expressed deep resentment and anger toward her parents, particularly her mother, whom she described as often hysterical and prone to taunting, especially when drinking. Nancy would reportedly deride Elizabeth for running off to Europe with Melinda or for perceived character faults. Elizabeth also claimed that her mother hated men, and that both her parents told her the only reason they stayed together was because of her. Dr. C. Robert Showalter, a psychiatrist who would later examine Elizabeth, noted that her mother was perceived as seductively attentive, yet critically rejecting. He observed that Elizabeth felt compelled to placate and appease her, agreeing even at one point to pose nude for her upon request, suggesting a compulsive dynamic in their relationship. In August 1984, Elizabeth Haysom and Jens Zuring were introduced at a dormitory barbecue at Watson Hall, a brick, 4-story co-ed dormitory on the western edge of the University of Virginia campus. The event was a social gathering sponsored by school officials at the beginning of the academic year, designed to help students become acquainted. Watson Hall housed first-year Eccles scholars in arts and sciences and Rodman scholars in engineering, with women residing on odd floors and men on even floors. Despite the intense attachment that would later develop between them, there was no instant magic when they first met. No sparks flew when their eyes locked across the barbecue. Elizabeth's initial impression of Jens was that he was a little wimp, or more precisely, an aggressive little wimp. Before meeting Elizabeth, Jens generally kept to himself both at UVA and at his previous school, Lovett. He was remembered by peers for his arrogance, his belligerence in expressing opinions, and his cynical approach to college life, traits that did not endear him to others. Around Thanksgiving, Elizabeth's attitude toward Jens began to shift. He had started initiating conversations with her, particularly sharing his low regard for French women, which Elizabeth found amusing. She found herself drawn to his foreignness and European aura, finding these qualities irresistible. More than that, she was compelled by what she described as his weirdness, something he wore like a badge, delighting in being different. Elizabeth, as she put it, sopped it up. Elizabeth herself was considered weird by American students. Having cultivated thought patterns from growing up in England, she rejoiced in her unconventionality. She decorated her dorm room eccentrically and played David Bowie music at high volume. Her beautiful British accent further set her apart, making her seem exotic and granting her a certain respect as a woman of experience. They clung together as kindred spirits, seeing themselves as allies amidst what they viewed as shallow Americans. For Jens, who had been largely socially isolated, Elizabeth represented his first flesh-and-blood relationship. She was good-looking and smart, suave and sophisticated, and worldly, capable of eloquent discussions on literature, film, and bisexuality. They began dating seriously in November. By the Christmas holidays, they had decided to be in love. Jens underwent a noticeable personality change after they started dating regularly. His cynicism and arrogance seemed to evaporate. He became more tolerant, jolly, and talkative, especially with Elizabeth, whom he aimed to impress with his wit and knowledge. They shared a passion for writing and literature. Elizabeth was working on a novel while Jens, initially a psychology major, shifted his focus to film and screenwriting. They also developed a peculiar shared interest in designing a supercar, a hybrid between a Porsche and a Ferrari, despite neither having any prior interest in automotive engineering. Academically, their performances diverged significantly. Elizabeth's grades at UVA were less than mediocre, consisting of C's with one F. Jens, by contrast, was on the dean's list. During the Christmas holidays of 1984, geographic separation intensified their relationship rather than cooling it. Elizabeth spent the holidays at her parents' home in Boonesboro, Virginia, before departing on a ski trip to Yugoslavia. Jens remained with his family in Detroit, where his father had been reassigned. Despite the physical distance, they maintained constant contact through extensive journals and letters. Elizabeth began a 9-page journal, half diary, half letter, for Jens, with entries spanning December 20 to 24th, 1984, which she mailed on December 28th. Jens responded with a 39-page, mostly typewritten letter, indicating the care he took to please her. These journal entries and letters became vehicles for increasingly disturbing discussions. Words like death and murder crept into their conversations. Initially, these discussions remained hypothetical, described as an intellectual game similar to their supercar designing sessions. However, The conversations gradually became more serious and more specific, evolving from abstract ideas about how to murder someone into a bitter examination of the alleged abuse Elizabeth claimed to suffer from her parents and their supposed attempts to separate the young lovers. Elizabeth took the initiative in these discussions, discovering what she would later describe as Jens's exceptional affinity for violence. In her December 21, 1984 entry, Elizabeth explicitly stated her hope that her mother's drinking would give her the courage to kill her father. She made references to wishing her parents would die and hinted that murder might be necessary in subsequent entries. By early March 1985, their discussions had shifted to specifically talking about Derek and Nancy Haysom. Elizabeth strategically built Jens's ego, telling him he was intelligent, witty, and urbane. She appealed to what she characterized as his German machismo, by emphasizing her dependence on him as an escape from her parents, who she claimed were treating her more cruelly than ever. She encouraged Jens to share her anger toward her parents, suggesting that their lives would be immeasurably better without them interfering. Her March 8, 1985 letter from Colorado was a complete fabrication designed to manipulate Jens into supporting her plan. In this letter, she presented a fictional scenario involving inheriting a house from Lady Astor, contingent on her parents' approval. She used this fabricated situation to imply that the only path to their happiness and her inheritance, free from parental control, lay over her parents' dead bodies. She offered to pay for his brother's education and travel to Europe with him, but only if she forfeited her inheritance, thereby forcing the decision onto Jens. Jens's letters during this period were largely egocentric, reflecting themes of self-doubt and sexual awakening. While he made veiled references to the possibility of killing Elizabeth's parents, he didn't appear to take the discussions as seriously as Elizabeth initially did. He responded to Elizabeth's prompts about burglaries and voodoo, suggesting something worse than theft or that voodoo was possible. During one exchange, Jens experienced an outburst where he declared, "I could blow their bloody heads off," possibly prompted by Elizabeth's parents sending her on a ski trip with her half-brother instead of allowing her to remain with him at the university. Jens confided in Elizabeth about his impotence and discussed his bizarre sexual fantasies. He also expressed strong resentment toward his own father, describing him as a hot-tempered martinet who had driven his mother to alcoholism, and hatred for his maternal grandmother for withholding wealth from his mother. Elizabeth consistently expressed deep resentment and anger toward her parents throughout their correspondence. She conveyed bitterness over being sent to boarding school and her parents' decision to force her into science and mathematics, which had caused her to repeat an entire academic year. She explicitly told Jens, "I wish they were dead," when discussing her parents. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On Friday, May 30th, 1986, investigator Ricky Gardner sat at his desk in Bedford County, Virginia, plodding through a pile of paperwork and trying to concentrate. The Haysom murder case had gone cold since Elizabeth and Jens fled the country the previous October. When the phone rang, the department operator informed Gardner that some guy on here with a funny accent wanted to speak to him. Gardner, initially unenthusiastic and thinking it might be a prank call from his former partner Chuck Reed, mumbled, "Come on, Chuck, I'm busy." The caller persisted patiently, asking, "Are you the Mr. Gardner who's looking for a Jens Zuring and an Elizabeth Haysom?" Gardner asked sharply, "Who is this?" The voice calmly identified himself as Detective Constable Wright in Richmond, England, adding, "I have 2 questions for you." Wright then posed the critical questions. "Are Elizabeth Haysom's parents dead?" Gardner replied, "They sure are." Wright continued, "Were they murdered?" It was at this point that Wright declared, "This isn't a game. I'm a detective in England, and I think we have your murderers incarcerated." When Wright explained the basis for his belief, their letters to each other, the ones we found in their flat, Gardner stammered, "Letters? What letters?" His heart began to pound with excitement. Prior to Wright's call, U.S. authorities, including Sheriff Wells, had been aware that Jens and Elizabeth were arrested in London for shoplifting fraud, but they had no evidence to directly tie them to the Haysom murders. The chain of events leading to Wright's discovery began when Jens and Elizabeth were caught committing check fraud at a Marks & Spencer store in Richmond, England. They were using aliases and had large amounts of cash and newly purchased merchandise. When Detective Sergeant Kenneth Beaver and Detective Constable Terry Wright investigated, they found numerous green Marks & Spencer shopping bags, multiple bank books under different names, and various fake identification cards in their flat. Crucially, they also discovered a stack of letters signed Elizabeth and Jens, along with a student's exercise book filled with diary-style entries. Through reading these documents, Wright began to uncover references that pointed to the Haysom murders in Virginia. The journal mentioned Jens seeing officers Reed and Gardner in Bedford, and noted his methodical wiping of fingerprints from his room and car. Some entries also hinted at the IRA, which was taken very seriously by British police. Wright specifically found Elizabeth's Colorado letter, where she discussed how they could be rich if only her parents were dead, and her claim that her parents could not entirely disinherit her. The British detectives, especially Wright, meticulously pieced together the incriminating information from the found documents, which prompted Wright to contact the American authorities. Immediately after Wright's call, Gardner frantically contacted Commonwealth Attorney Jim Updike, shouting, "They've got Elizabeth and Jens. They've tied them to the murders. They want us to come over." Updike, initially surprised, quickly recognized the gravity of the news. The two decided to travel to England as soon as possible to examine the letters and formulate a plan. A significant challenge arose immediately. Neither Gardner nor Updike had passports. They moved with urgency and secrecy to obtain them, wanting to surprise Jens and Elizabeth upon their arrival in London. They left for Washington, D.C. on Sunday, June 1st, to be at the passport office first thing Monday morning. On Friday, March 29, 1985, Elizabeth Haysom and Jens Zuring rented a 1985 Chevette in Charlottesville and drove to Washington, D.C. Elizabeth would later claim they planned to spend the weekend together, visiting art galleries, memorials, and watching movies. After seeing 2 movies, she returned to their hotel room. At 11:30 p.m., when Jens had not returned, she decided to take a taxi to a Georgetown cinema playing the Rocky Horror Picture Show. As she was about to abandon her search for the theater, Jens drove up, traveling against traffic. When she opened the car door, she saw that Jens had a sheet draped across his waist which was covered in blood. She screamed, asking if he was all right, but he yelled, "Shut up," 3 times. They drove in silence to the hotel garage, where Jens, remaining out of the light, ordered her to retrieve a parking ticket. He then pulled into a dark parking slot. It was then that Jens told her, "I killed your parents." She saw blood everywhere. Jens ordered Elizabeth to go to their room and fetch a change of clothes, though she offered him her raincoat to cover himself instead. Jens went into the shower, instructing her to clean up the car. She complied, returning upstairs to find him asleep. Later, Jens provided Elizabeth with details of what had occurred at Loose Chippings. He told her that her father put up a hell of a struggle and had exclaimed, "My God, what do you think you're doing?" He claimed he killed her mother first, slitting her throat after approximately 40 minutes of conversation in the dining room, after which Nancy staggered into the kitchen. He continued fighting with Derek, saying her father just wouldn't lie down and die, and possessed enormous strength. Jens mentioned suffering cuts on his left hand, on both his thumb and little finger, during the struggle. He told Elizabeth he had lost his glasses during the fight, making everything appear hazy. Elizabeth added that Jens told her he had initially left the scene, then returned to the house because he felt compelled to do so, possibly to ensure that Derek and Nancy were actually dead. Jens expressed particular distress about having run over and apparently killed a dog on his return journey from Boonesboro. He ordered Elizabeth to meticulously clean the car, focusing on the seat, pedals, steering wheel, radio, dashboard, rearview mirror, and the front area where he had struck the dog. He was emphatic about removing any traces of the animal's remains. Elizabeth claimed she spent the night awake, returning to the garage before dawn to double-check her cleaning of the car. She denied feeling any relief about her parents' deaths, stating that her first thought had been for Jens's survival, followed immediately by the need to save our skins. They gathered his bloody clothing and disposed of most of it down the garbage chute in their dormitory at UVA. Elizabeth never saw the knife again, as Jens told her he had thrown it away. Upon his return to Virginia, even before Updike could fully recover from jet lag, he requested that a special grand jury be convened. Within the week, on Friday the 13th, the 5-member grand jury listened to Ricky Gardner for an hour. Soon after, they handed up indictments charging Jens Zuring and Elizabeth Haysom with first-degree murder for the deaths of Derek and Nancy Haysom. Jens was additionally charged with capital murder, allowing Updike to seek the death penalty. On Friday, June 6, 1986, when Jens was brought in for questioning by British investigators, he initially approached the interview arrogantly and egotistically, concerned with gaining information rather than giving it. He directly asked, "What's going to happen to me?" When Detective Beaver asked why, Jens matter-of-factly responded, "Because I murdered 2 people. You know that, don't you?" After this admission, he appeared to relax, treating the interview like a game or an intellectual exercise. Before Sunday, June 8th, Jens had provided detectives with practically everything they wanted to know about what had happened at the Haysom house on March 30th, 1985, admitting to the killings at length and in detail. His transcripts were ordered sealed for various legal reasons. During these admissions, Jens also revealed physical evidence of the struggle, lifting his left hand to show 2 thin scars and stating, "I got those at loose Chippings," referring to the Haysom residence. He attributed his actions to being in love with the girl, stating, "We talked about killing her parents. I didn't want to do it, but I drove to their house to kill them, and I got caught." Despite his detailed confession to the murders, Jens remained evasive about Elizabeth's direct involvement. When asked if she knew why he was going to see her parents, he was silent for a long time before slowly stating, "I would have to say that we discussed it, obviously, but I don't think that either of us was truly clear about what was going to happen at all." He added, "I don't know how Elizabeth felt about me driving down there, or what she thought my motives were. I don't know what she thought." On Sunday, June 8th, 1986, Elizabeth Haysom, after spending the afternoon and evening contemplating what Jens might have told the detectives, became convinced she had been betrayed because she had remained silent while Jens was jabbering his head off. At 9:55 p.m., she pressed the call button in her cell and requested to see Detective Beaver. She pointedly asked him, "Has he admitted the murders to you?" While Beaver did not directly confirm, he stated, "I'm perfectly happy with the way the investigation is going," which Elizabeth noted with a worried look. Just 15 minutes later, she summoned Beaver again, stating, "I want to get this off my chest once and for all." She requested that Gardner not be present, so Beaver summoned Detective Constable Wright as a witness. At 11:15 p.m. on June 8, 1986, Elizabeth began giving what would become known as version 1 of the story of her parents' deaths. In her initial statement, Elizabeth described their trip to Washington, D.C., where they purchased a butterfly knife for Jens's brother, though she never explicitly said it was for the murders. She claimed Jens later confessed to her in the car, stating, "I killed your parents," after she noticed a sheet draped across his waist covered in blood. She said she was terrified and didn't know if she believed him at the time. She admitted Jens had cuts on his left hand. She claimed Jens ordered her to clean the blood from the rental car, which she did. When pressed about her reasons for staying with Jens despite his confession, she offered several justifications: guilt, feeling responsible for what happened, loyalty to Jens because she loved him very dearly and needed him so much, her desire to prevent Jens's execution, and fear that police would blame her. She admitted Jens had threatened to surrender or commit suicide if she left him, especially upon realizing she actually loved her parents. She also stated that Jens had wiped his fingerprints from their apartment, but she denied doing so herself, claiming she had already submitted her prints to police. However, as the interview progressed, Beaver challenged her inconsistencies, particularly concerning her prior writings. He confronted her with excerpts from her letters, where she spoke of doing voodoo on her parents, willing them to death, taking up black magic, wishing they would lie down and die, and getting rid of them. When asked to reconcile this with her claim of always loving her parents, she initially gave no reply. Beaver then became more confrontational, suggesting her actions in Washington were to create an alibi. After being pressed relentlessly, Elizabeth eventually shifted her narrative. She stated, "All right, I let him into it. I did everything." When Beaver questioned if she knew he was going to do it, she again said, "I did it myself," though she later claimed this was facetious. She eventually admitted that she and Jens had been plotting the confrontation for about a month, and that Jens went to her parents' house with the knife with the possibility of killing them, and she knew that. At one point, she directly stated, "We did it together, and in some ways, I'm more guilty than he is. He loved me beyond reason. I love him beyond reason, too." She concluded by stating, "I suppose I used that love. Because of my own weakness of character, many times I have tried to wriggle out of that responsibility and the guilt of putting him in this position. I can't do that any longer. It was my will that made him kill my parents. He wouldn't have done it, I am sure, if he hadn't loved me so much, and I, him." She clarified this by saying, "Although I wasn't physically present, I suppose I was spiritually there." The real turning point in Elizabeth's feelings for Jens and her stance in the case occurred in November 1986, when she saw for the first time the crime scene photographs of her parents' bodies. These photographs, taken by investigators at Loose Chippings, showed in unrelenting detail how viciously her parents had been murdered. Elizabeth viewed them while giving a deposition, as they were attached to another document she was shown. Her reaction to seeing these images was one of profound shock. She described living with these photographs, stating, "They were in my cell. They were on my person. They were with me wherever I went, and they were in my mind's eye the whole time as well." This experience led her to believe that absolutely nothing could justify what he had done, what I had done. She felt that everything else just became irrelevant. The details of who did what to whom. He had butchered my parents. It was there, sitting in front of me. It wasn't just words, it was there. And I was in some way, shape, or form part of that. I was responsible for it. This visceral encounter with the brutality of the murders fundamentally changed her perspective and her loyalty to Jens. She realized that no matter what I felt specifically for Jens, there was no way I could continue to have a relationship with him or to pander to his whims or needs. It was at this moment that she decided to plead guilty to her role in the murders. Furthermore, she also resolved to try to see that Jens shouldered his share of the blame as well. She explicitly stated her willingness to cooperate with the prosecution in building a case against Jens, confirming that she would testify if called upon. This shift in her position was also fueled by her growing belief that Jens had manipulated her throughout their relationship. Initially, she had believed she was the manipulator, a role she had assumed in her discussions with investigators. However, seeing the crime scene photos and later reading Jens's letters, particularly one he wrote to a friend named Neil Woodall in May 1986, confirmed to her that Jens was deliberately manipulating me to believe those things and that she had no control over him whatsoever. She realized she had been used and that Jens knew precisely what he was doing. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On December 11, 1986, Elizabeth wrote a letter, approximately 1.5 pages long, to Jens Zuring. In this letter, she informed him of her crucial decision. She had decided not to fight extradition and planned to return to Virginia to plead guilty to the charges against her. Beyond merely accepting the murder charges, Elizabeth also mentioned other wrongs she felt guilty of, particularly something that might not have occurred to Jens, how she had ruined his life. She suggested that because he was saintly, he probably hadn't considered this, but she hoped he wouldn't think too badly of her when he eventually did. Jens, however, did realize her impact on his life and was already starting to think not very kindly toward her. On December 17, 1986, Elizabeth Haysom and Jens Zuring appeared in Kingston Crown Court in England to be sentenced on bank fraud charges. Both Elizabeth and Jens received 1-year sentences, with credit given for the time they had already served. Immediately following the sentencing, detectives from Scotland Yard produced warrants for their arrest for the murders of Derek and Nancy Haysom, issued by Virginia authorities. During this court appearance, Elizabeth later claimed that a woman she had never seen before attempted to attack her in the dock, an incident she believed Jens had orchestrated to frighten her. However, a story in the next day's London Times did not mention this attempted attack, leading to speculation that it might have been another one of Elizabeth's excursions into fantasy. Jens's letter to Elizabeth, dated December 18, 1986, just a day after their sentencing, urged her to stop and think about her actions and quit acting stupid, indicating his view that the situation was still completely under control. The contentious encounters between Jens and Elizabeth marked the death knell for their relationship. When they appeared together in court again in February 1987, their animosity became public. Jens growled at Elizabeth, telling her, "You're going to be damned sorry." His words or demeanor must have been perceived as threatening by court officials, because in their subsequent court appearances, Jens was handcuffed to a policeman and kept well away from her. This particular court date in February 1987 was the last time Elizabeth Haysom saw Jens Zuring in person. On April 14, 1987, the day before her 23rd birthday, Elizabeth Haysom appeared in court for her extradition hearing in England. During this hearing, the judge issued an order for her return to the United States. Elizabeth had previously made up her mind regarding this outcome, and therefore she did not contest the decision to be extradited. This stance contrasted sharply with Jens Zuring's vigorous fight against his own extradition to Virginia, where he faced a potential death penalty, seeking instead to be sent to Germany or to remain in the United Kingdom. Elizabeth was confident that she would be able to convince the judge in the U.S. to give her a sweetheart sentence, and believed she would walk on the charges in Virginia, even telling fellow inmates at Holloway Prison about her confidence in returning to the U.S. She also kept a low profile at Holloway and did not share her concerns about the murders with investigators, believing, "They have nothing on me." On the evening of May 8, 1987, a commercial flight touched down at Washington Dulles International Airport. Among the passengers was Elizabeth Haysom, flanked by law enforcement officers. She had just completed a grueling journey from London's Holloway Prison, where she had spent months awaiting extradition back to Virginia. The charges she faced were as serious as they were shocking. Accessory to the brutal murders of her own parents, Derek and Nancy Haysom. Sheriff Wells was waiting at Roanoke Airport to collect Elizabeth for the final leg of her journey to Bedford County. By the time they arrived, it was well past 10 p.m. on this Friday night. Despite having traveled for over 19 hours, Elizabeth appeared mentally sharp and running on pure adrenaline. Her first request surprised everyone present. She wanted to speak immediately with investigator Gardner. Gardner hadn't spoken to Elizabeth in nearly a year. When the call came to return to the station, he found a young woman who was physically disheveled but mentally focused. During her months in British custody, Elizabeth had been reflecting on her previous statements. She had also obtained copies of psychiatric reports concerning her former boyfriend and co-accused, Jens Zuring. These documents had, in her words, made her seethe. She was determined to ensure that Jens would share the blame for what had happened at Loose Chippings on that March night in 1985. What followed was Elizabeth's third version of events surrounding the murders. She maintained her earlier claims that she and Jens had planned the killings for a month and traveled to Washington to establish an alibi. However, she now introduced a significant new element to her story. Elizabeth admitted that she had not gone to the movies that afternoon as previously claimed. Instead, she revealed she had gone to a bar searching for drugs, specifically heroin. According to Elizabeth, she had successfully obtained the heroin, but it was too diluted to provide the high she desperately craved. Her focus that day, she claimed, was entirely on getting her next fix. This selfish obsession, she said, made her indifferent to Jens' intentions. She wanted him out of the way so she could concentrate on scoring drugs. While she accepted responsibility for her irresponsibility and manipulation of Jens, she emphasized that he had acted of his own free will and had a choice not to commit the murders. Elizabeth provided disturbing new details about Jens' state of mind upon returning to their hotel after the killings. She described him as distraught, not about her parents' deaths, but about running over and killing a dog on his drive back from Boonesboro. According to Elizabeth, Jens showed more concern for this animal than for Derek and Nancy Haysom. He had instructed her to meticulously clean their rental car, paying particular attention to the pedals, steering wheel, and front bumper to remove any trace of the dog. Elizabeth claimed she lay awake all night, unable to sleep, and rechecked her cleaning work before dawn to avoid Jens' wrath. Perhaps most chilling was Elizabeth's revelation about what she called Jens' hit list. This list allegedly included her half-brother Howard, Jens' own grandmother and parents, and shockingly, investigator Ricky Gardner himself. Elizabeth explained that Jens believed Gardner knew in some sort of way what he had done, and therefore posed a threat. Jens had apparently plotted to kill Gardner at his home, with Elizabeth providing his alibi back in Charlottesville. She claimed she had distracted him from this plan by fabricating a story about having a brain tumor requiring experimental laser treatment. But Elizabeth's most explosive allegation concerned her relationship with her mother, Nancy. She claimed that Nancy had sexually abused her, stating that her mother had slept with me ever since I was a little girl. The last incident, according to Elizabeth, occurred on the Saturday before the murders, Derek's birthday, March 23, 1985. She described Nancy coming to her room after drinking, disrobing, and getting into bed with her. When later pressed by prosecutors about these allegations, Elizabeth's statements remained deliberately ambiguous. Elizabeth also addressed the nude photographs that had been found in Nancy's bureau during the investigation. She confirmed these had been taken by her mother in the summer of 1984, claiming Nancy used them to make her feel absolutely filthy and disgusting during arguments. As dawn broke on May 9th, Gardner concluded this lengthy interview. Elizabeth's new version of events would prove crucial in the legal proceedings to come. 3 months later, on August 24, 1987, Elizabeth appeared before Judge William Sweeney in Bedford County Circuit Court. Her court-appointed attorneys, Hugh Jones and Drew Davis, had met with her regularly since late May. Despite their urgings to explore other defense strategies, Elizabeth remained resolute in her decision to plead guilty. Her lawyers had convinced her to plead guilty to 2 counts of accessory before the fact rather than first-degree murder, though both carried identical sentences. This distinction was strategic. It implied that Elizabeth was not physically present at Loose Chippings during the murders, countering persistent rumors that she had been there. Judge Sweeney and most courtroom observers were surprised by Elizabeth's guilty plea. Commonwealth attorney Jim Updike, however, was less shocked. He accepted the plea, noting that it carried the same punishment as first-degree murder and that her presence or absence at the scene was irrelevant to him. Updike made it clear there had been no plea bargaining. The sentencing hearing began on Tuesday, October 6, 1987, 30 months and 4 days after the murders. Elizabeth had chosen her appearance carefully, wearing a plain, long-sleeved beige dress that observers compared to a monk's robe. Her hair was combed straight back, she wore no makeup, and her demeanor was markedly more submissive than during her interrogations. Under oath, Elizabeth presented what would be her most refined version of events. She now claimed her incriminating letters to Jens were metaphorical, and that he had misinterpreted her desire to get her parents out of her life as a literal death wish. She portrayed herself as a victim of Jens's manipulation, rather than the manipulator she had previously claimed to be. Crucially, Elizabeth now denied purchasing the butterfly knife or planning the murder weapon with Jens. She claimed this story had been fabricated at Jens's instruction after the murders to make her more a part of the crime. According to this new account, Jens had initially told her he used a steak knife from the Haysom kitchen, but later showed her a picture of a butterfly knife in a Soldier of Fortune magazine while they were in London, instructing her to say that was the type she had purchased if questioned. Elizabeth testified that the turning point in her feelings toward Jens came in November 1986, when she saw crime scene photographs of her parents' bodies for the first time during a deposition. The brutal images shocked her into the realization that absolutely nothing could justify what he had done, what I had done. This moment, she claimed, ended her loyalty to Jens and prompted her decision to plead guilty and cooperate with prosecutors. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On October 8, 1987, Judge Sweeney delivered Elizabeth's sentence. He acknowledged her as a sensitive, poised, gifted, intelligent, articulate person with an IQ that likely exceeded his own. However, he also recognized what he termed her perverse attributes, describing her as a liar, cheat, manipulator, and drug abuser. Sweeney sentenced Elizabeth to 2 consecutive 45-year prison terms, totaling 90 years. Under Virginia law, she would be eligible for parole in 1999. Elizabeth remained emotionless as the sentence was pronounced, offering her wrists for handcuffs and walking from the courtroom without tears. Within hours of pronouncing sentence, Judge Sweeney began having second thoughts. Concerned he had been too lenient, he feared Elizabeth could be released in as little as 12 years with good behavior. On October 15th, just 1 week after sentencing, he wrote to the state parole board, urging them not to grant Elizabeth early release due to the seriousness of the charges and the heinous nature of the crimes. While Elizabeth began serving her sentence at Goochland Prison, Jens Zuring continued fighting his extradition from Britain. His legal battle would prove to be groundbreaking in international law. On June 30th, 1988, the House of Lords rejected Jens's appeal. 8 days later, his lawyers filed a motion with the European Commission of Human Rights, claiming his extradition would violate the Council of Europe Treaty. Their argument wasn't based on opposition to the death penalty itself, but on what they termed the death row phenomenon, the prolonged waiting period of 6 years or more for execution, which they argued constituted inhuman and degrading treatment. On August 3, 1988, Jens was ordered extradited to Bedford County. However, as he was being removed from his cell at Brixton Prison and was literally on the verge of being put on an airplane bound for the United States, he suffered a complete mental collapse. This dramatic incident led to his extradition being postponed while the Human Rights Commission considered his claim. Jens was transferred to a prison hospital where psychiatrist Dr. D. Sumk examined him. The doctor reported that Jens was convinced he would be convicted and sentenced to death if returned to Virginia. He feared the long wait on death row, being an outcast due to his nationality and social class, and facing attacks from other prisoners. These fears had driven Jens to beg the psychiatrist to supply him covertly with means whereby he would be able to kill himself if extradition became imminent. Prison officials kept him in the hospital's suicide watch unit until November 1988. The European Court of Human Rights ultimately ruled 19-0 in Jens's favor, on July 7, 1989. The court found that extradition to the United States would expose him to a real risk of treatment going beyond the threshold set by the convention. They cited the very long period of time spent on death row in such extreme conditions, and Jentz's age and mental state at the time of the offense. This decision placed Commonwealth Attorney Jim Updike in an impossible position. He initially refused to drop the capital murder charge, viewing the court's decision as international blackmail. He publicly stated, "If it occurs that this case becomes Germany versus Züring, then as far as I'm concerned, Germany can go to hell." However, on August 1, 1989, UK Home Secretary Douglas Hurd announced that Britain would only extradite Züring on condition that he not face the death penalty. Faced with this ultimatum and pressure from federal authorities, Updike ultimately surrendered to expediency and agreed to abandon his plan to seek Jentz's execution. With this hurdle cleared, Jentz quietly agreed not to contest his return any longer, just before Christmas 1989. In January 1990, almost 4.5 years after fleeing the United States, Jentz Züring was flown back to Bedford, Virginia. Physically, he had changed little except for being considerably heavier. Arriving in a green sweater, blue jeans, and athletic shoes, with his characteristic dark-framed glasses, he appeared much younger than his 23 years. One observer remarked he looked like he's 16. On January 17th, just 4 days after his return, Jentz appeared before Judge Sweeney for a hearing on trial technicalities. It was formally agreed that he would face only first-degree murder charges, with a maximum penalty of life in prison. The trial was set for late spring. Jentz's murder trial began on June 1, 1990, in the same courtroom where Elizabeth's sentencing had occurred. The primary shock came during opening statements when Jentz's chief lawyer, Richard Neaton, claimed his client could not have killed the Haysums because he was not even in Virginia at the time of the murders. Instead, Neaton asserted Jentz was in Washington, D.C., creating an alibi for Elizabeth. This was a shrewd legal strategy designed to counter Elizabeth's consistent accusation that Jentz had committed the murders out of love for her. The prosecution's case was notably thin on physical evidence, directly placing Jentz at the scene. No murder weapon was found, and no witnesses could place him at loose Chippings. The trial essentially became a test of credibility between Elizabeth and Jentz. Elizabeth took the stand on June 13, 1990. Her demeanor was strikingly different from her composed appearance at pretrial hearings. She appeared pale and nervous, her hands shaking and her voice weak. Prosecutor Updike, whose role was now reversed, treated her gently as she was now his key witness. Elizabeth's testimony presented yet another version of events, this time fully admitting her complicity in planning the murders. She explicitly stated that she had wanted them dead and had worked hard to manipulate Jentz to kill them. She described planning a confrontation with her parents, with her staying in Washington to provide an alibi while Jentz drove to Boonesboro. When Jentz said, "Then if I don't like it, I'll kill them," Elizabeth testified she replied without hesitation, "That's fine." She described practicing forging Jentz's signature, ordering room service to create evidence of his presence, and purchasing movie tickets while creating a public disturbance to ensure they would be remembered. This increased admission of culpability was attributed to her fixed sentence. With nothing left to lose, she could now focus entirely on ensuring Jentz's conviction. During his testimony, Jentz denied committing the murders and presented a radically different version of events. He claimed Elizabeth owed money to a drug dealer and needed to collect a package in Washington. According to Jentz, he had created an alibi for her, and when she returned late that night, she was wearing different clothes and had a brown substance, implied to be blood, smeared on her arms. Most dramatically, Jentz claimed that Elizabeth told him forthrightly that she had been to Boonesboro and that she had killed her parents. He alleged they then devised a plan for him to take the blame, believing that as the son of a diplomat, he might be deported to Germany and tried as a juvenile, facing a maximum sentence of only 10 years. This, he claimed, would save Elizabeth from a potential death sentence. The case went to the jury shortly before 3 p.m. on June 21, 1990. After rejecting an offer to take the evening off, the jury returned at 6:40 p.m., looking somber and determined. They found Jens guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and recommended 2 life sentences. When Judge Sweeney asked if there was any reason judgment should not be passed immediately, Jens defiantly snapped, "Yes, because I'm innocent." He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his earlier arrogance replaced by what observers described as a look of total defeat. A juror later revealed they had agreed almost immediately that Jens was guilty, but spent nearly 4 hours deciding between first and second-degree murder. If sentenced to consecutive life terms, Jens would not be eligible for parole for at least 20 years. The case that had begun with 2 young lovers fleeing across the Atlantic had finally reached its conclusion in the same Virginia courtroom where it all started. Both Elizabeth Haysom and Jens Zuring would spend decades behind bars for their roles in the brutal murders of Derek and Nancy Haysom on that March night in 1985. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Elizabeth Haysom was serving her sentence at the Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women in Troy, Virginia. She first became eligible for parole in 1995 and submitted a request every 3 years thereafter. Under Virginia law, her sentence was subject to mandatory parole, meaning she would have been automatically released in 2032, 45 years after her conviction. For decades, the case had been marked by shifting narratives and contested evidence. During a rare 2016 interview, Haysom broke her usual silence with the media. She claimed that Jens Zuring had killed her parents in a rage after discovering that her mother had sexually abused her. Zuring, however, maintained a different version of events. He contended that Haysom had killed her parents herself over the abuse, though Haysom had originally denied that any such abuse had occurred. In the same 2016 interview, Haysom expressed that she was profoundly ashamed of her role in the murders and criticized Zuring for continuing to maintain his innocence. Meanwhile, Jens Zuring had been fighting his own legal battles. He became eligible for parole in 2003, but his requests were repeatedly denied. By early 2017, his 12th parole request had been rejected. A petition for an absolute pardon had been filed on August 22, 2016. Since the original trial, several troubling issues had emerged regarding the case. Richard Neaton, Zuring's defense attorney, was later disciplined and eventually disbarred for reasons unrelated to Zuring's case. Neaton also admitted to having had a drug problem while representing Zuring. Additionally, the presiding judge, William M. Sweeney, had a personal connection to the case. He knew Nancy Haysom's brother, Elizabeth's uncle, and had previously presided over Elizabeth's court proceedings. The evidence that had convicted Zuring was also coming under intense scrutiny. A blood-smeared sock print had been the prosecution's main piece of evidence against him. Robert Hallett, the prosecution's expert witness who was not actually an expert on footprints, claimed he could match it perfectly to Zuring. Years later, an FBI agent would dismiss the witness's methods as a magic trick. More significantly, Ed Sulzbach, an FBI profiler who had reportedly been asked to consult on the case, had reached a different conclusion entirely. According to some familiar with the case, Sulzbach determined that the crime had been committed by a female who knew the Haysoms, and he identified Elizabeth as the likely killer. Detective Ricky Gardner, who worked on the case, denied that a profile had been created by Sulzbach, and no report was entered into evidence at Zuring's trial. Sulzbach had reportedly matched the sock print to a female in his analysis. In 2009, a breakthrough in forensic technology allowed investigators to test DNA evidence from the crime scene that had been previously too advanced to analyze. 42 pieces of DNA evidence were examined. Of these, 31 were either too small or too degraded to yield results. However, the 11 samples that were successfully tested excluded both Zuring and Elizabeth Haysom from the crime scene. This DNA evidence began to shift opinions among law enforcement. Chuck Reed, one of the original investigators of the Haysom murders, had harbored long-standing doubts about the outcome of the case. His participation in the 2016 documentary The Promise led him to take these doubts more seriously. On May 3, 2017, Albemarle County Sheriff J.E. Chip Harding released a 19-page report following a months-long investigation he had conducted into the case. His conclusion was unequivocal. Jens Zuring was innocent. Harding formally asked Governor McAuliffe to pardon him. The momentum for Zuring's release continued to build. On September 27, 2017, Sheriff Harding held a press conference alongside investigator Richard L. Hudson, Jr., advocating for Zuring's release. They presented expert testimony from 3 forensic scientists who agreed that Zuring's DNA did not match the blood found at the crime scene. International attention focused on Zuring's 13th parole hearing on October 10, 2017. Germany's Ambassador Peter Wittig and former President Christian Wolff attended, along with Zuring's counsel, Stephen Rosenfield. Following the hearing, Ambassador Wittig told the assembled media, "We are deeply convinced of the innocence of Jens Zuring." 2 weeks later, on October 27, 2017, another press conference was held by Gail Starling Marshall, former Deputy Attorney General of Virginia. Stephen Rosenfield announced that the University of Richmond School of Law's Institute for Actual Innocence was supporting Zuring's pardon petition based on the DNA evidence that excluded him from the crime scene. After more than 3 decades behind bars, change finally came. On November 25, 2019, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam accepted the Virginia Parole Board's recommendation to release both Haysom and Zuring. Neither received a gubernatorial pardon, but both were released into the custody of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement for deportation to their respective home countries of Canada and Germany. They remain permanently ineligible to re-enter the United States. Elizabeth Haysom was deported to Canada in January 2020 after serving more than 30 years in prison. Jens Zuring returned to Germany on December 17, 2019, landing in Frankfurt. Since his return to Germany, Zuring has rebuilt his life as an author and speaker. He has published 8 books and works as a consultant. His case has made him something of a media figure in Germany, where he has appeared on numerous well-known talk shows, presenting himself as a victim of American justice system failures. In autumn 2023, he appeared in an exclusive Netflix special. However, his media presence has not been without controversy. German journalist Felix Jung criticized the uncritical platform given to Zuring, writing that German talk shows enable the convicted double murderer Jens Zuring to present himself uncritically as a victim of U.S. justice. Jung argued that instead of critically questioning criminals, the media was enabling a cult of personality that can be marketed in pop culture. During his incarceration at Buckingham Correctional Center in Dillwyn, Virginia, Zuring had undergone a spiritual transformation, converting from Buddhism to Roman Catholicism. He became a prolific writer while imprisoned, publishing several books and articles. His 1995 autobiography, Mortal Thoughts, was described as the autobiography of a young man imprisoned for a double murder he did not commit. In 2007, his book, The Convict Christ, was awarded first prize by the Catholic Press Association of North America in the category of social concerns. In Germany, legal restrictions prevent Zuring from publicly accusing his ex-girlfriend Elizabeth Haysom of the crime, adding even more complexity to a case that had already challenged the American justice system's handling of international defendants and the reliability of forensic evidence from the 1980s.